If you were to make a top 10 list of the female heroes of faith throughout Scripture, who would make the list? I think for the vast majority of us, Sarah would be on the list. Mary would obviously be on the list. Individuals like Rahab and Deborah and Esther and Hannah, I think all of them would make the list. And we would probably come up with a few lesser-known individuals to put on there, maybe a Priscilla or a Dorcas or even an Abigail. I think there's a few different women who could make the list, but would Rebekah make your list? If you were coming up with the 10 biggest female spiritual heroes in Scripture, would Rebekah, the wife of Isaac, the mother of Jacob and Esau, make the list? I think for most of us, she probably wasn't an initial thought. But I think it's because she might be the most misunderstood mother in the entire Bible. See, many preachers and commentators view Rebekah in a negative light. Just listen to how she is described in Truth for Today's commentary at the introduction of Genesis chapter 27. Isaac's wife Rebekah was strong-willed and controlling. She manipulated matters in the home and even took advantage of her husband's blindness to secure his blessing for her favorite child, Jacob. When you read that description, does it make you think favorably of Rebekah? That description makes her sound deceitful, selfish, merciless, and it gives the impression that she was not a godly person. But is that a fair summarization of Rebekah's character? This evening, I want us to take another look at Rebekah because I believe she is a woman whose spiritual worth often gets overlooked because her actions in her most popular story are misunderstood. Of course, I'm talking about the account that we read in Genesis chapter 27, that famous story when Isaac is going to bestow the blessing upon his eldest son Esau, and Rebekah intervenes to ensure that the blessing goes to their younger son Jacob instead. But before we dive into that story, I want us to take a few minutes to consider what we know about Rebekah's character from the previous accounts we have of her in Scripture. So I want us to journey back in the book of Genesis to the 24th chapter. We are first introduced to Rebekah in Genesis chapter 24 when Abraham sent his servant off to procure a wife, a bride for Isaac. Now, the assignment this servant was given was no simple assignment. This servant has to go find a woman to marry Isaac in an age of arranged marriages, but he has to deal with stipulations that Abraham has placed upon him. Two in particular are important to note. Abraham's first stipulation was that the bride must be from his own family. Now, in order for this to be achieved, the servant would have to travel back to Mesopotamia, where Abraham lived when God called him. He would have to go search for Abraham's brother Nahor, or at least the family of Nahor, in order to find someone that's related to Abraham that's not among his immediate, limited descendants. That stipulation made the servant's task difficult, but not impossible. The difficulty lay in the fact that Abraham seemingly had had no contact with that side of his family for 65 years. 65 years. That's a lifetime for some people. And the reason Abraham wanted a relative to be Isaac's wife was ultimately to protect his covenant with God. Abraham knew that if Isaac married one of the Canaanite women, she might sway him toward their religion and thereby jeopardize God's covenant with Abraham and with Abraham's descendants. So Abraham places the stipulation. The bride had to be from Abraham's extended family. Not easy, but not impossible. The second stipulation that Abraham gave his servant was that Isaac was not allowed to leave Canaan. That meant this servant couldn't take Isaac with him. It meant the servant would have to procure a bride from a family they haven't seen in more than 6 decades by convincing them to let their daughter leave with him. Now, while that limited selection made this task difficult, by having to restrict the candidates from one particular side of Abraham's family, that didn't make it impossible. But this may have. This upped the challenge significantly because they could not meet the groom to whom their bride would be given. And the standard practice of the day was for a man to leave his family to live near the bride's family. I mean, isn't that essentially what Genesis chapter 2 and verse 24 says? Therefore a man shall leave his father and mother and hold fast to his wife, and they will become one flesh. Who's expected to do the leaving? It's not the bride, it's the groom. And yet in this scenario, the groom can't even leave his home, so the bride has to leave hers. For a groom and a family that she has never met. So the servant has to convince a woman to leave her family and relocate to the groom's family. But despite these stipulations, Abraham assured his servant that God would oversee the process, that God would be with him. So upon his arrival in Mesopotamia, the servant asked God to give him a sign that would reveal who should be Isaac's bride. Look at the prayer that Abraham's servant prayed in Genesis chapter 24, beginning in verse 12. And the servant said, O Lord God of my master Abraham, please grant me success today and show steadfast love to my master Abraham. Behold, I am standing by the spring of water, and the daughters of the men of the city are coming out to draw water. Let the young woman to whom I say, please let down your jar that I may drink, and who shall say, drink, and I will water your camels, let her be the one whom you have appointed for your servant Isaac. By this I shall know that you have shown steadfast love to my master. Now, the servant wants God to reveal the right candidate by her willingness to draw water from the well for him and for his camels. Now, that may not seem like a big deal to you and me, but the servant's requested sign is unique. You see, when the servant asked a young lady if she would give him a drink, he expects her to say yes because that was the custom. The custom was to show hospitality to strangers by supplying them with a drink of water. But it was not normal for someone to go the extra mile by providing water for all of the guests' animals as well. In particular, camels. And that's because a camel that has gone a few days without water can drink as much as 25 gallons of water. Now, the ancient jars that were typically used for drawing water usually held no more than 3 gallons. considering the fact that this servant of Abraham brought 10 camels with him, an offer of an individual to draw water for these camels could result in 80 to 100 drawings from the well. And yet that's exactly what Rebekah offers to do. Look at Genesis chapter 24, picking up in verse 18 and going through verse 20. When the servant requested a drink, Rebekah said, "Drink, my lord." And she quickly let down her jar upon her hand and gave him a drink. Verse 19 says, when she had finished giving him a drink, she said, "I will draw water for your camels also until they have finished drinking." So she quickly emptied her jar into the trough and ran again to the well to draw water, and she drew for all his camels. Now, I want you to pay attention to some of the language in this passage as it describes Rebekah's activity. She quickly drew the water. She ran to the well. And she drew water for all his camels. When I reflect on this terminology, it indicates to me that Rebekah was ready to serve at a moment's notice. In other words, she wasn't picky with her service. She wasn't choosy with her service. I think she was the type of individual who was willing to serve anytime, anywhere, as soon as this stranger said, "Hey, can you get me a drink?" She's jumping into action, not just for him, but for everything that is with him. And I think this terminology also indicates that Rebekah was going to serve to the best of her ability. She wasn't going to exert minimal effort. She was going to give it her all. She's quickly drawing. She's running. She's taking care of all the animals. I think Rebekah was the type of individual who was willing to go above and beyond the call of duty when it came to service. I think she's exhibiting all the traits that anyone would want in a spouse, but more importantly, the traits that you would find in a follower of God. You see, Rebekah's fulfillment of the servant's request not only revealed God's divine intervention, it also revealed her servant spirit. A spirit that God expects of all of us. God expects us to be second-mile servants, meaning that we don't just go the required 1 mile, but we'll go the second voluntarily. Do you remember what Paul wrote in Colossians chapter 3, verse 23 and 24? He said, "Whatever you do, work heartily as for the Lord and not for men, knowing that from the Lord you will receive the inheritance as your reward, for you are serving the Lord Christ." To me, when I look at Rebekah, she's modeling that kind of mindset. Even though she's not yet familiar with Yahweh, she's serving as if she is. And this is evident from the fact that she's willing to do more than was required of her. The requirement, culturally speaking, was to provide water for the individual stranger. But she goes the extra mile and provides for his animals well, and she does it with maximum effort. I think we see in this scenario a person that's not spiritually evil, that's not selfish, that's not even deceitful. I think we see someone worth modeling. The next thing we know in the story of Rebekah is that Abraham's servant is back at her homestead negotiating with her relatives for her to marry Isaac. The decision as to whether or not Rebekah would be allowed to marry Isaac was up to her parents and her brother Laban, apparently, who seems to be operating as the head of the clan at this point. And they agreed to this union between Rebekah and Isaac. But when Abraham's servant pushed to be allowed to return to his master immediately with Rebekah in tow, they were less agreeable. Look at what happened in Genesis chapter 24, beginning in verse 54. When they arose in the morning, that's about halfway through verse 54. When they arose in the morning, Abraham's servant said, "Send me away to my master." Rebekah's brother and her mother said, "Let the young woman remain with us a while, at least 10 days. After that she may go." But the servant said to them, "Do not delay me, since the Lord has prospered my way. Send me away that I may go to my master." They said, "Let us call the young woman and ask her." And they called Rebekah and said to her, "Will you go with this man?" She said, "I will go." What's interesting about this situation is the fact that Rebekah was allowed to weigh in on the matter. It was unusual in the ancient world for women to have any part in major decisions. I mean, Rebekah was not consulted with regard to the marriage. But when the servant asked to leave right away, they looked to Rebekah for her consent. She's probably consulted because of the substantial risk involved in leaving her family, leaving her realm of protection to go off on her own. We have to remember that she is leaving her family instead of Isaac leaving his. She and her family are probably aware that they're never going to see each other again, and that she will not have their protection and their security nearby as she enters into this marital union. So when Rebekah said, "I will go," she was giving up some things. She was giving up protection and security. But she was also giving up heritage. See, she grew up in a family that did not necessarily worship the same God that Isaac's family worships. According to Joshua chapter 24 and verse 2, prior to Abraham's call, his family served other gods. In other words, they were not monotheistic, nor were they worshipers of Yahweh. Later in Genesis chapter 31, we learn that Rebekah's brother Laban, who's a part of these negotiations, he continued to worship other gods because he possessed household gods that his daughter Rachel stole from him. So she's coming from a family that is not necessarily worshiping Yahweh. They might know of Yahweh because of Abraham before his departure, but she's not necessarily a follower of him. But what's so very fascinating is that in this moment, nobody's talking about the gods of Terah, the ones that her family had been worshiping. They're only discussing the God of Abraham and the God of Isaac. So I want you to notice what she's hearing during the conversations about her going with this servant. This is going to be a little bit of an extensive reading, but bear with me. Beginning in verse 34 of Genesis 24, this is what Rebekah's hearing during the discussion about her marrying Isaac. So the servant said, "I am Abraham's servant. The Lord," and notice the references to Lord. You hopefully recall that when you come across Lord in all caps in the Old Testament, that's a reference to the proper name Yahweh. So I'm going to read it like that. "I am Abraham's servant. Yahweh has greatly blessed my master, and he has become great. He has given him flocks and herds, silver and gold, male servants and female servants, camels and donkeys. And Sarah, my master's wife, bore a son to my master when she was old, and to him he has given all that he has. My master made me swear, saying, 'You shall not take a wife for my son from the daughters of the Canaanites, whose land I dwell, but you shall go to my father's house and to my clan and take a wife from my son.' I said to my master, 'Perhaps the woman will not follow.' But he said to me, 'Yahweh, before whom I have walked, will send his angel with you and prosper your way. You shall take a wife for my son from my clan and from my father's house. Then you will be free from my oath when you come to my clan. And if they will not give her to you, you will be free from my oath. I come today to the spring and said, O Yahweh, the God of my master Abraham, if now you are prospering the way that I go, behold, I am standing by the spring of water. Let the virgin who comes out to draw water, to whom I shall say, please give me a little water from your jar to drink, and who will say to me, drink, and I will draw for your camels also. Let her be the woman whom Yahweh has appointed for my master's son. Before I had finished speaking in my heart, behold, Rebekah came out with her water jar on her shoulder. And she went down to the spring and drew water. I said to her, please let me drink. She quickly let down her jar from her shoulder and said, drink, and I will give your camels drink also. So I drank, and she gave the camels drink also. Then I asked her, whose daughter are you? She said, the daughter of Bethuel, Nahor's son, whom Milcah bore to him. So I put the ring on her nose and the bracelets on her arms. Then I bowed my head and worshipped Yahweh and blessed Yahweh, the God of my master Abraham, who had led me by the right way to take the daughter of my master's kinsman for his son. Now then, if you are going to show steadfast love and faithfulness to my master, tell me, and if not, tell me, that I may turn to the right hand or to the left. Then Laban and Bethuel answered and said, the thing has come from Yahweh. We cannot speak to you bad or good. Behold, Rebekah is before you. Take her and go, and let her be the wife of your master's son, as Yahweh has spoken. My point is this: during this entire negotiation, during this entire conversation, all Rebekah hears is the name of Yahweh. She's getting it drilled into her head right now that this connection, that these circumstances, that the providence she's experiencing were all orchestrated by Yahweh. And she knows that if she marries Isaac, she's marrying into a faith system that worships, that trusts, that obeys one and only one deity, and his name is Yahweh. So when Rebekah said, I will go, she was not just agreeing to relocate or to marry Isaac. She was agreeing to surrender her life to the will of Yahweh. And that's an expectation that God has for all of us. God expects us to yield, to surrender, to obey, just like Rebekah. You remember what Jesus said in Matthew chapter 16, verse 24? He said, if anyone would come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. There is an expectation of surrender in these words. And I think Rebekah modeled such a denial of self as she came to accept that God was in control. And this is evident by the fact that she was willing to go even when it meant she would have to give up everything she has ever known. That's not an evil person. That's not the example of someone who is anti-God. This is the example of someone who's surrendering to God. So as we step up to Genesis chapter 27, and I encourage you to turn there, as we step up to Genesis chapter 27, and we're considering this woman, let's not forget her storyline so far. Someone who has exemplified service and someone who has exemplified surrender. And now we come to the notorious story. I said go to Genesis chapter 27. I actually need you to take a pit stop in Genesis chapter 25 before we get there. Because we need to read something about her conception of these two boys, Jacob and Esau. When we get to Genesis chapter 25, we read the following. We're told in verse 22 that the children struggled together within her, and she said, if it is thus, why is this happening to me? So she went to inquire of Yahweh. And Yahweh said to her, 2 nations are in your womb, and 2 peoples from within you shall be divided. The one shall be stronger than the other. The older shall serve the younger. When her days to give birth were completed, behold, there were twins in her womb. The first came out red, all his body like a hairy cloak. So they called his name Esau. Afterward, his brother came out with his hand holding Esau's heel. So his name was called Jacob. Isaac was 60 years old when she bore them. When the boys grew up, Esau was a skillful hunter, a man of the field, while Jacob was a quiet man, dwelling in tents. Isaac loved Esau because he ate of his game, but Rebekah loved Jacob. Now, we need to make a couple of observations at this point. First, I want you to notice that when Rebekah was having difficulty with the pregnancy, what did she do? She consulted with Yahweh. This woman who grew up in a household that worshiped other deities is now, when things get difficult, when she doesn't understand what's happening, what's her first reaction? To go to God. This is a woman who has so surrendered that she knows where to find answers now. She knows who to talk to when things are difficult. The fact that Rebekah turned to the one true God in this moment of concern reveals theological transformation in her life. I believe that it shows that she is wholly devoted to Him at this point. And I believe that her devotion to Him is also evidenced by the fact that He speaks to her. God doesn't speak to a lot of people in the Old Testament, much less to women. But He chooses to speak to this one. She's only the second woman in the Bible to receive direct communication from God, the first being Hagar. Now pay attention to what God has to say to her. He indicates 3 things. He says first, she's going to have twins. There's going to be 2 within you. He then indicates that there's going to be a multi-generational conflict between these brothers and their families, that there is going to be division between them. And 30 indicates that the eldest would ultimately serve the youngest. And that last revelation was especially important because it was not customary for the eldest to serve the youngest. The eldest was the one to receive the birthright. That's the double portion of the inheritance. Well, Jacob ends up negotiating for that one himself with a pot of stew. And the eldest was supposed to receive the blessing. The blessing was the assignment of patriarchal leadership. The one who receives the blessing becomes the head of the clan. So when God said the older shall serve the younger, He was indicating that the youngest of Isaac and Rebekah's children, which is Jacob, was going to become the one who receives the blessing. God is giving a prophetic message here about the future of Rebekah's children to Rebekah while she's pregnant. It's important for us to note what God said to Rebekah about her children. And it's also important to note that at the end of that passage in Genesis 25, we're told that Isaac loved Esau, but Rebekah loved Jacob. Now, to be fair, when the text says Isaac loved Esau, but Rebekah loved Jacob, it's not simultaneously inferring the converse, that Isaac hated Jacob and Rebekah hated Esau. It's not saying that. The use of the word love here is not an indicator that the other child is unloved by that particular parent. Instead, it's used in the sense of favoring one child over the other. We're told why Isaac favored Esau. It's because he ate of his game, but we're not told why Rebekah favored Isaac. Why Rebekah favored Jacob. My hunch is it's because of that oracle. It's because God had told her the older shall serve the younger. But we don't know that for sure. Now, with this background, with this understanding of what God prophetically told Rebekah about her children, and this situation where both parents have a favorite child. Let's go to Genesis 27 now, to the notorious account of how she helps Jacob deceive Isaac. In Genesis chapter 27, the first 4 verses say this: When Isaac was old and his eyes were dim so that he could not see, he called Esau his older son and said to him, "My son." And he answered, "Here I am." Isaac said, "Behold, I am old. I do not know the day of my death. Now then, take your weapons, your quiver and your bow, and go out to the field and hunt game for me. And prepare for me the delicious food, such as I love, and bring it to me so that I may eat, that my soul may bless you before I die." What Isaac is saying is, okay, go hunt some wild game. Prepare it for a meal. And as we feast on that, I'm going to pronounce the blessing upon you. It's time for that graduation, so to speak. Well, if we keep reading in verse 5, we find out that Rebekah overhears this conversation between Isaac and Esau. And once Esau left on his hunting trip, she jumped into action. She told Jacob what was happening and told him what he would have to do in order to receive the blessing in Esau's stead. Now, Jacob was concerned that her plan wouldn't work, and he worried about bringing a curse on himself rather than a blessing. He expresses those concerns in verse 11 and verse 12 of Genesis 27. But Rebekah is so adamant about proceeding with this. In verse 13, she says, "Let your curse be on me, my son. Only obey my voice and go." Now, at this point in the story, we don't think ill of Isaac, but we do think ill of Rebekah. We think Rebekah's doing something wrong here. We see Rebekah as conniving and deceitful, but a few observations about this situation need to be acknowledged before we proceed. And they have to do with Isaac's failures in the moment. First, we have to remember that Isaac favors Esau just as much as Rebekah favors Jacob. It's not just a story about Rebekah's favoritism, it's a story about Isaac's favoritism too. He's just as guilty of this as she is. Second, we must concede that it's at least possible Rebekah has shared God's oracle or God's prophecy that He gave her during the pregnancy with Isaac. It's conceivable that she's told Isaac what God said. I mean, think about Joseph, their grandson. He's going to have these crazy dreams, these offensive dreams. And yet, what's the one thing Joseph can't resist doing? He can't resist sharing these dreams with his family. He wants them to know what he's experienced, what he's heard, what's been shared with him. And despite how jealous it makes his brothers or how upset it makes his dad, he can't resist telling them because he wants them to know what he knows. Put yourself in Rebekah's shoes. God speaks to you. God shares something with you. Are you going to refrain from telling your husband? Are you going to refrain from telling the father of those children what God said about those? You think she didn't tell him that she's been told there's twins? I mean, as soon as somebody gets pregnant today, we start contemplating twins. Do they run in your family? You know she talked about it. I'm going to presume, and granted, I know that's not fair to do when you deal with Scripture, but my expectation is Isaac has been told the prophecy. And I think that's why Isaac has summoned only Esau to the blessing ceremony. You see, this was not the way these ceremonies were supposed to be done. The blessing ceremony, they were important events in the family. events for which all of the children were supposed to be present, so that the father could speak to each one in order. And in so doing, he would organize the succession of authority within the family. If you turn over to Genesis 49, and I'm not telling you to do that right now, but check it out later. In Genesis 49, we read how Jacob does this with his family. All 12 of those sons are present, and he starts with Reuben and works his way down. Reuben doesn't get the inheritance, Reuben doesn't receive the blessing, though, because of some of his own sinful activities. Neither do the second-born or third-born sons of Jacob. It's not until the fourth-born son of Jacob that the blessing is bestowed on Judah. But every kid was present. There's something deceptive, actually, about Isaac's activity here. To try to orchestrate this without Jacob present. These factors leave open the possibility, at the very least, that Isaac himself was operating deceitfully. As one commentator said, it seems clear that Isaac intended to bypass Jacob completely, either by ignoring or forgetting Yahweh's prophecy to Rebekah. I imagine this possibility. Isaac's heard the message from Yahweh about the older serving the younger, but the older is his favorite. So I just need to get the blessing put on him before God does. Now, with that thought in mind, think about what Rebekah's doing here. Maybe Rebekah's just trying to make sure that God's prophecy comes to fruition. Or to say that another way, maybe she's just trying to ensure that God's will is done. And I find it interesting when we compare a couple of statements made by Isaac and Rebekah. I think it shows Rebekah's motive. You see, Isaac said to Esau in verse 3 and 4, "Now then, take your weapons, your quiver and your bow, and go out to the field and hunt game for me, and prepare for me delicious food, such as I love, and bring it to me so that I may eat, that my soul may bless you before I die." Rebekah overheard this, and when she retells it to Jacob, notice the phrase she inserts. Bring me game, quoting her husband, quoting Isaac, "Bring me game and prepare for me delicious food, that I may eat it and bless you before the Lord, before I die." Rebekah's focus, or Rebekah's statement, includes a focus on Yahweh. Unlike Isaac, she acknowledges that the blessing was before the Lord. And I think this difference between their statements matters because Rebekah shows an awareness of something that Isaac is seemingly ignoring. That this whole blessing thing involves God. And I think that's why she intervened. I think she was aware that what Isaac was about to do would contradict the prophecy that God revealed to her during her pregnancy, and therefore she had to get involved to make sure that God's will was fulfilled. I don't think Rebekah is operating in this story to promote her own agenda, to focus on the child she favored. I think she's involved in the story because she loves Yahweh. What's interesting to me is that in Genesis 27, at the end of the chapter, the very last verse, it's Rebekah who brings up the need for Jacob, who has now received the blessing, to be sent off to their relatives to find a wife so that he doesn't secure one from among the Canaanite women. She is the one urging Isaac to implement the policy that Isaac's dad used to bring her into the family. She is expressing the same concern for protection of the covenant that Abraham expressed. She's the one with that level of focus on the will of Yahweh. So when Rebekah helped Jacob obtain Isaac's blessing, she was ensuring that her family was obedient to God. I don't think this is her trying to be deceitful. I don't think this is her trying to get her way. I think this is solely her trying to promote God's will. And I think she's a precursor to a couple of other wives who do the same thing. You can go over to Exodus chapter 4 and read about Moses' wife, Zipporah. There's an occasion where Moses and Zipporah are on their way back to Egypt, and God is trying to kill Moses. And Zipporah intervenes, and she intervenes by circumcising his boys because Moses had failed to do something God expected of him. But Zipporah stepped in and saved the day to make sure her family was right with God. And we're told that after she did that, God relented. Then you can go over to the book of 1 Samuel, to the 25th chapter, and you've got this guy, this king named David, a man after God's own heart who has lost his cool with another man who cheated him. And he's on his way to kill that man. And this woman named Abigail steps up and intervenes. She just happens to be married to the man David wants to kill. But she protects her husband from David and protects David from himself by intervening in that moment. And when that man died, you know what David did? He went out and made Abigail his wife. He's like, if there's a woman out there that protects her family that much, I want her on my side. Rebekah, to me, is the precursor to those ladies. Someone who's got her family's interests in mind as she makes them connect with God's interests. It makes me think of what Jesus said in Matthew chapter 16, verse 23, when he turned to Peter and said, "Get behind me, Satan. You are a hindrance to me, for you are not setting your mind on the things of God, but on the things of man." I think Isaac had his eyes set on the things of man. Rebekah had her eyes set on the things of God. And so Rebekah modeled a heart and a mind that were so committed to the will of God, she was going to pursue it and prioritize it in every facet of her life. In that vein, she reminds me of a little spacecraft called Voyager 1. Brody got really excited about that for some reason. Voyager 1 was launched on September 5th, 1977. It was supposed to travel to Jupiter and Saturn and to Saturn's largest moon, Titan. It was going to take a few pictures, send back some scientific data. In fact, its primary mission ended on November 20th, 1980. But that little thing just kept going. In fact, that little thing is still going. It has traveled 15.5 billion miles from Earth. It is considered to be interstellar at this point. And now, more than 45 years after it was launched, it's outside the solar system, and it's still sending back data. It is the most distant man-made object from the Earth, and it's expected to be able to continue its operation into the 2030s, until some point when its generators will no longer be able to supply enough electric power to operate it. But here's what I love about Voyager 1. It was designed to do this one thing, but it just keeps on going. It just keeps on doing for NASA. And the reason it makes me think about Rebekah is because Rebekah is this individual who's not much is expected from, not much is concluded about. But all she cared about was being faithful to the will of God. And as a result, she has done more than was ever expected of her. What about you? I take us to look at Rebekah because I think she's misunderstood. And I think there's an example in her life worth imitating. An example of prioritizing God above all else, no matter how it makes you look. Does that define you? Do you so prioritize the Lord that every decision is directed toward Him? If not, we gather here so we can right things. And it may be that in your life at this moment, something needs to be righted so that God is receiving the priority. It may be that you need to put on Christ in baptism today. Whatever your need is, we are gathered here tonight to help. And if you have a need, then we invite you to come while together we stand